Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Kevin Reid.
Well, thank you all for your warm welcome. I hope to fill in some information for you you may already know about in the Battle of Midway, maybe some things you don't know about it. One of the things I've looked at recently is, was Midway the turning point of the Pacific War? A lot of books, especially the popular books about World War II, say after Midway, America was going to win the war in the Pacific, so it was the turning point. Everything changed right after Midway. It's easy to make those claims because, well, it's going to sound like I'm whining, but we live in kind of a sports culture. So if the right team gets the right touchdown, then everything else is going to follow, right? And that's kind of the way we sometimes look at battles. And a lot of that's tied back. If you have a simple, easy battle to describe and there's an easy victor, then you can say this was the turning point. The same thing happened, everybody's heard of Waterloo. What happened at Waterloo? Napoleon got defeated and the wars ended, right? Well, the reason Waterloo was really decisive wasn't so much the fact that he got defeated on that one day, but the fact that the French and the British and the Austrians and the Russians and the Prussians had been fighting for, 17 years before that day. And by the time that day was over with, there weren't any French soldiers left. So they had to stop fighting, so the war was over. So was that battle decisive because it was a big victory or because everybody was exhausted? And in some ways, Midway is kind of the same thing about the Pacific. There are a lot of things that changed after the Battle of Midway, but it was the first really big victory we could see. And so it's played up a lot by the press. And as I go through today's talk, you may understand some of why they talked about it so much. And again, remember, as you heard in the earlier talk, Pearl Harbor was a big surprise for everybody. And there's a short period of time for about 6 months where everything seemed to be going the Japanese way. So we lost at Pearl Harbor. We had a lot of people killed. We had a bunch of battleships sunk, a lot of airplanes shot down. The Japanese took over Hong Kong and Singapore and occupied Burma and occupied the Netherlands, East Indies, which is what we now call Indonesia. Oh, and the Americans lost Wake Island, and then they lost Guam, and then they lost the Philippines. You can begin to see where it sounds like the Japanese are winning everywhere. So when we finally get a victory, there's a real reason for the Americans to be excited, and that's part of it. Also part of it is a lot of the way history has been written in the past. One of the things that professional historians do is not just lecture like I'm doing, but you also try to understand how we learned about the past. And every few years, the past gets kind of reinterpreted. It's not because we want to throw out the old things, but sometimes books are written before the information is really known. So a lot of the people that think that they're really well versed on the Battle of Midway have read books that were written in the 1950s or the 1960s, like Walter Lord wrote Incredible Victory, Gordon Prang wrote Miracle at Midway, etc. And those have become sort of the standard things that we turn to. But there's been a lot of research that's been done in the last few years, especially looking at communiques that were secret at one point, and also people that have done research by looking at the Japanese records. So now we have not only our stories, but the Japanese stories, and we can meld the two and come up with a better understanding of what actually happened in the battle. So today, that's kind of what I want to talk about. Of course, part of it too is there's been a number of movies made. There have been 2 Midways, and of course there's also in 2001 where there's that very famous movie Pearl Harbor, and that sets a lot of people's expectations too. And unfortunately, Hollywood, as Jimmy Stewart says, when the legend becomes a legend, print the legend, don't print the fact. And there's a lot of truth to that in a lot of movies. So while the movies may be entertaining and they may have great actors and sometimes even good screenwriting, sometimes they aren't exactly steeped in good facts. So you might want to remember that too. So I want to talk a little bit about background of the battle. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to be here for the Pearl Harbor talk. But I really want to start with the discussion of why the Japanese attacked us in the first place. And the sort of subtext to that everybody thinks of is, why the hell did they think that they were going to win a war against the United States? You got what, 40 million Japanese, 45 million Japanese, and 150 million Americans. They don't have enough raw materials to actually feed their families or to keep their industry going, and we're the biggest industry in the entire world, and they think we can win. Why were they so stupid? Why would they do something like that? Well, like everything else, it's wrapped up in history. And what we don't tend to think about is the fact that the Japanese had done something kind of similar before at the turn of the 20th century. In 1904, the Japanese went to war with Russia. And after 7 or 8 months of fighting, the Russians actually negotiated a peace treaty and the Japanese won the war. How did they begin the war? They began the war with a surprise attack on a Russian fleet in an unknown harbor in the Pacific. They sank most of the fleet. By the time the Russians could get another fleet to reinforce their troops, the Japanese were waiting for them. They fought a great big battle called the Battle of Tsushima. They sank most of the Russian fleet. They captured the rest of the Russian fleet, and the Russians had to sue for an end of the war. So here's little teeny Japan, the first non-European nation in 200 years to actually seriously defeat a European nation, and they think to themselves, hey, we've done it once, why can't we do it twice? There's some reason for that. Now, interestingly enough, because history kind of follows, there's some interesting and unique interesting crosses. And at the Battle of Tsushima, which the Japanese won in this war, one of the young Japanese naval officers was a man by the name of Isoroku Yamamoto, who in World War II would be the commander of the Japanese fleet. So, here's a guy who's, 17, and he can see that you win a naval battle and you win the whole war. So when Japan starts having problems and they're starting looking at economic problems, they look at the British and the French, the Americans. They have these empires. Why can't they have an empire like everybody else does? And then when the Germans and the British go to war and the French go to war, they can't really get in the way of the Japanese, and the Japanese start thinking, well, let's create our own empire. The only thing that might stand in the way would be America. Now there's a question from the front of the audience today, which kind of introduces a topic, and that is in the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the United States went to war with Spain, we also took over their colony of the Philippines. And from 1898 until 1947, the Philippines were a quasi-colony of America. Now, why is that important to the Japanese? Because all the raw materials and food and so forth that the Japanese didn't have access to had to come back to Japan. And a lot of it had to come past the Philippines. And a lot of it came from what we now call Indonesia, which the Japanese and everybody else called the Dutch East Indies. That's where they got their oil, their tin, their bauxite for aluminum, a bunch of their iron ore. They got a lot of food out of Southeast Asia, but the Philippines were in the way. So when the Japanese were looking at expanding, they had a problem, and that is wherever America was, it was in the way, and America was the only great power that wasn't involved in World War II. So if they could destroy the American fleet, which is what they'd done in 1904, right, with the Russian fleet, and then to defeat the American army, then America would sue for peace, just like the Russians did. And at the very tail end of it, the Japanese expected we're going to fight this very big naval battle somewhere in the Pacific, and we'll sink whatever remnants there are of the American fleet. But first, we're going to destroy the most important ships in the American fleet, the battleships. Now, you'll sometimes see reference in the histories to what they called capital ships. Capital ships were battleships and big heavy cruisers that had big cannons on them, and they were just beginning to talk before World War II about another class of capital ships, what we call aircraft carriers. Now, the Americans saw aircraft carriers as something that you had with the fleet, and the airplanes flew around and they looked for where the bad guys were. And then if there was a naval battle, they'd fly over the naval battle and watch where our shells were landing so that they could send back corrections to our gunners. Now, let's talk a little bit of physical reality. Naval battles in World War I and World War II. Those battleships had cannons that had 16-inch diameter, and they fired shells out to 20 miles. Think about that for a second. 20 miles. So if a battleship were parked right here and we fired them, they'd be firing all the way out to Fort Branch. Think about that for a minute. How can you see where your shells land? You need an airplane or a couple airplanes to keep track of things. So actually, the very first airplane mounted on ships were British experiments in World War I. So the British started the idea of the aircraft carrier, but again, they thought of them more or less as adjuncts to the artillery. When the Japanese started building up their navy, they started to think, well, airplanes can attack other ships. Maybe we could use our airplanes not just to keep track of where the shells are landing, but maybe to drop some bombs. And by the time you get to World War II, everybody had done that. But the British innovators had come up with the first real use of especially torpedo bombers. So when we talk about today's lecture, we're going to talk about 3 types of airplanes. We're going to talk about fighter planes, we're going to talk about dive bombers, and we're going to talk about torpedo bombers. What are the difference? Fighters are supposed to fly very fast. They have a bunch of machine guns on them. They're supposed to shoot all the other airplanes down. Torpedo bombers are going to fly close to the water, and they're going to drop torpedoes that will then actually speed to the target. The difference between a torpedo and a cannon is you have a very big warhead in a torpedo and a motor that drives that torpedo to the target. So they have more power with a torpedo warhead almost than these big explosive shells that are fired out of these 16-inch cannons. They're a lot cheaper, they're a lot easier to maneuver, and the airplanes have to get relatively close to the water so that when the torpedo hits, it'll run to the target. But while you're low to the water, everybody can shoot at you, and it's easy to shoot you down. So the Americans actually in the 1920s started introducing the idea of dive bombers. You get close to your target and you dive at the target, and as you get closer and closer to the target, you release the bomb, and it's going to follow your flight pattern. You pull away like this, and it'll go right on top of the ship. The advantage of the dive bombers is they can start really high, and they go very, 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 very fast while they're dive bombing, and they're hard to shoot at. Because it's hard to track them, and it's hard to get the shells in the right place. And experiments after the war with Japanese anti-aircraft guns, for example, show that it took between 1,500 to 2,000 rounds from the light Japanese anti-aircraft guns to hit an airplane. On average, 1,500 to 2,000 shots from the light Japanese anti-aircraft guns to hit an airplane. Think about that for a second. And you can see where the dive bombers have some real advantages. On the other hand, they're not that well armored, and they can be shot down pretty easily, especially as they start pulling out of the dives. So all 3 of those planes are going to be found on aircraft carriers. The Japanese come up with a clever plan. The Japanese are actually the first to come up with the idea of combining 3 or 4 or even 5 or 6 aircraft carriers in different convoys so that the airplanes from each can meet together and attack. And when they attack, they don't attack as one force. They'll attack with one group low with the torpedo bombs, one group high with the dive bombing, and if they arrive at the target at the same time, if you're an anti-aircraft gunner, do you shoot at those planes, or try to do both, and you're being shot at by the fighter planes too, and it's really hard to be effective, and so the bombs get in. The Japanese are actually the innovators in this. They're the first to think of working together in what they call aircraft carrier divisions. So they have aircraft carrier division 1, aircraft carrier division 2, aircraft carrier division 3 and 4. There's 2 carriers to each division, and whenever they operate together, they can have some airplanes flying over the aircraft carriers to protect them. That's called combat air patrol. They can also have groups of dive bombers and torpedo bombers all working together so that they show up at the same time at the same place. And if you read the accounts of Pearl Harbor, when the attack started at Pearl Harbor, the very first bombers to come in were the torpedo bombers, and as the guys were going, oh my God, we're being attacked, then the dive bombers started. So the anti-aircraft gunners are already starting to shoot, and then uh-oh. And so you can see how, if everything times out just perfectly, it can be a really dangerous combination. But notice that little introduction, if everything times out perfectly. That's one of the problems. Okay. So there's also something else I want to talk about in terms of strategy just for a moment, and that is from when we took over the Philippines, the Americans began to think that at some point we might end up going to war with Japan, because Japan wanted to become an independent power, wanted to become a great power like the Germans and the British and the French, the Americans. So they did all the same things we did. They built an army, they built a navy, and they got really smart. If you want to have an army, have Germans that you hire to train your troops on discipline and how to fire things. If you want to have a navy, who do you hire? You hire the British Royal Navy to train your sailors. And then you buy your battleships from the British at first, and then you start building them yourself. So they're becoming very, very competitive in the Pacific. And as things developed in World War I, the Japanese stayed on the side of the Allies, and they got some of the old German colonies, and the Americans began to get nervous. So the Americans came up with a plan. If we ever go to war with Japan, what do? Well, we figure if we go to war with Japan, they're going to attack the Philippines. So they're closer to the Philippines than we are. They're probably going to take over the Philippines. So what do? As soon as the Japanese attack us, we're going to sortie our fleet from our headquarters on the west coast, and we'll go somewhere into the Central Pacific, and we'll meet the Japanese Navy, and we'll fight a big battle, just like Tsushima, only this time we expect we'll win, just like they think they'll win. And so the plan is really, okay, when they attack us, we're going to have this big battleship battle somewhere in the middle of the ocean, and we're going to defeat them, and then we can sail into Tokyo Bay and force them to surrender. It's a really good plan if the Japanese do what we want them to do, but instead of them attacking us in the Philippines, which is kind of what we expected, or maybe in the Dutch East Indies, which is what the British thought was going to happen, they instead attacked the biggest fleet that was in the Pacific that might be an enemy of theirs. That's the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. That's why they attacked at Pearl Harbor. Destroy the American fleet, and it's no longer a challenge. Okay, but we got lucky. And as you all have heard, I am sure, at Pearl Harbor, the big luck that the Americans got out of it was two things. The Japanese originally planned 3 waves, 3 attacks. An early morning attack, a mid-morning attack, and a late morning attack. The late morning attack was supposed to destroy all the repair yards and the oil storage facilities. The Japanese admiral in charge of the raid decided not to launch that 3rd wave. Why? Because the Japanese have a problem. They only have so big of a navy. They only have so many aircraft carriers. They only have so many pilots. They're starting to lose pilots to anti-aircraft fire and so forth. And so they're thinking, well, as soon as we're finished at Pearl Harbor, we have to go and we have to support the landing on Wake, and then we have to start fighting to take over the Netherlands East Indies, and one of our carriers actually has to support the attack on Malaysia. So, our aircraft carriers have to be in like 3 or 4 places, so you only have 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there, 5 weeks somewhere else. We can't dilly-dally around. So that's one reason why they don't do that attack. The other thing that made us very lucky is none of the American aircraft carriers in the Pacific were at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese arrived. Where were they? They were delivering airplanes to places like Wake Island, so if we did go to war, we'd have more airplanes that were scattered out further in the Pacific. So the Americans ended up having this really interesting situation where everybody in the world talked about capital ships. What are capital ships? They're battleships and they're cruisers. Big cruisers, right? Heavy cruisers. And sort of aircraft carriers, our battleships all got sunk at Pearl Harbor or so badly damaged you can't use them. We only have a few heavy cruisers in the Pacific. So our only capital ships in the Pacific are aircraft carriers. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, there's also a very big change that happened. And for those of you that like local history, it actually comes back to Henderson, Kentucky. The commander of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was Admiral Kimmel, husband E. Kimmel, who was a native of Henderson, Kentucky. Because his troops were caught by surprise, he was found guilty of dereliction of duty and he was relieved of command. The officer that was chosen to replace him was Admiral Nimitz. And Admiral Nimitz was the right man for the right job at the right time. He was very well balanced. He was a very careful man. He was a gambler sometimes. But he also was very smart in what he did. And his first response to what happened at Pearl Harbor is he started sending out our aircraft carriers in raids on Japanese positions in the Pacific Islands. He's not going to be able to destroy the Japanese main battle fleet or anything, but he's going to do attacks. And those attacks are going to keep the Japanese guessing as to where our carriers are going to be. At the same time he's doing this, our president, pissed off about the whole thing of Pearl Harbor, he goes back to the Air Force and the Army Air Corps and says, look, we need to come up with some way of getting back to the Japanese. We have to hit them. We have to prove to America that we can hit them. That is the genesis of the so-called Doolittle raid, where an American Army Air Corps officer, a colonel at that point, Jimmy Doolittle, who was a very well-known, he was an aeronautical engineer, he was a barnstormer, he was a colonel in the Army Air Corps, and he said, somebody came up with the idea we could use medium-range American bombers and we could fly them off of an aircraft carrier and use them to attack the Japanese. And so he raises a small group of pilots and aircrew. They put their airplanes on board the USS Hornet, and they sail to the outskirts of the Japanese territorial waters to launch so that they can actually bomb the Japanese home islands. The Japanese thought that such a thing might happen, that we might use our aircraft carriers to attack them. They never anticipated Army bombers, but they thought that carriers would show up. So they had picket ships all around the Pacific looking for American ships. They saw the aircraft carriers, they radioed back, so Doolittle's planes launched early. When they did, they arrived over Japan that had no idea that an air raid was going to happen. 18 airplanes. Each airplane carried about 1.5 tons of bombs. They attacked 6 Japanese cities. So you can pretty well figure that the real damage done to Japan was a great big whopping 0. I mean, they blew up a couple of buildings, they killed, I think, 20 civilians. They did almost no damage whatsoever, except to Japanese prestige and to the way the Japanese government operated. So I want to talk about the way the Japanese ran their government for a moment. We've all heard about the Emperor of Japan. When the United States first opened up Japan in the 1840s to American trade, the Emperor was very embarrassed to have to let Americans come in and trade with them. And a series of Japanese officials created a new, for lack of a better word, constitution that would kind of mirror the American Constitution. And what they created was what they called a cabinet government. The Emperor would appoint the head of his police, the head of his army, the head of his navy, etc. And all those heads of government organizations would report to the Emperor and tell him what's going on. And they all had to vote on procedures that were made. So a legislature wasn't really involved. All the decisions were made by the heads of these various organizations. And in the Japanese Constitution, the Army and the Navy were both represented in their cabinet. And so during the 1920s and 1930s, the Navy didn't like the Army, and the Army didn't like the Navy, and they didn't talk very much to one another. And so one of the problems, as it turns out, is the Navy wasn't always honest about what was happening, nor was the Army. So the Army actually fought a series of battles against the Russians in Manchuria, actually in Mongolia, pardon me, in late 1939. And the Japanese forces took so many heavy casualties they had to negotiate the end of the fighting. But the Army didn't want to tell the Navy we'd been kicked really badly, but the Navy found out about it. So the Navy said, look, if we're going to go somewhere, the Russians are too strong, let's go into the Central Pacific where the Americans will be weak. So one of the reasons why the Japanese Navy was strong in coming up with a strategy for Japan in World War II is because the Army had done such a poor job in fighting in Mongolia. So now the Navy's in charge of things, and the guy who's in charge of the planning for the Navy was this guy by the name of Yamamoto. He's this admiral now, and he's risen through the ranks, and he's a thinker that believes in the use of the aircraft carriers, modern technology, modern communications. And the problem is he is so successful in the first couple months of the war that nobody can get rid of him. And so when the combined fleet starts saying, hey, you want to do too much stuff, he says, well, you're going to do it my way or I'm going to quit. And I'm the most popular guy in Japan right now because we keep beating up the Americans and the British and everybody else, right? So do you want me to leave government or do you want to let me do what I want to do? What do you think the choice is? There is no choice. So one of the realities of cabinet government is it's officials within the government that are making decisions, not the emperor. So that's one of the problems that Japan's going to have throughout World War II. The other problem is, think about this for just a second. If the Army doesn't want to talk with the Navy doesn't want to talk with the Army, how do you do strategic planning for a war? Nobody really comes up and says, hey, if we're going to go to war against the United States, it's the biggest industrial power in the world, maybe we ought to organize our industry before we go to war, so we have full production before we start the war. They expect that the Americans will be defeated so quickly they won't have to worry about that. So there's no real strategic planning that takes